Well, good morning, everyone. It's great to be back in Southern. I want to say a special thank you to Michael Haken for his warm welcome and to Holly Hammond for doing everything to make the journey here so straightforward. You'll see what's probably an unfamiliar portrait of John Owen on my first slide. I want to say thanks to Tim Cooper, who discovered this portrait in Dr. Williams' library in London. And this is a portrait which opens up, I think, some new ways of thinking about Owen. We're used to thinking of him as rather thin-faced, hawk-nosed, kind of rebarbative Puritan. Here, he seems quite cheerful, well-fed, well-dined. And this is Owen at the height of his career in Oxford in the mid-1650s, wearing the very same academic robes that he would later try to ban in that decade. Of course, as Michael's just suggested, the real reason that image is up there is because it also is a frontispiece to an exceptionally reasonably priced biography of Owen, which is available for sale in the campus bookshop. John Owen died on the 24th of August, 1683, believing that the cause to which he had dedicated his life had failed. After the restoration of Charles II, the gradual unwinding of the English Revolution had been illustrated in the public torture of old republicans, the ejection of dissenters from the national church and their brutal persecution, and the formation of a new community of nonconformists that was quickly divided by disputes about the elemental doctrines of the Reformation. 20 years after the end of the Revolution, it seemed clear to Owen that the Puritan project of building godly congregations in reformed communities was in ruins. He was increasingly worried that the minds of professors had, he said, grown altogether indifferent as to the doctrine of God's eternal election, the sovereign efficacy of grace in the conversion of sinners, justification by the imputation of the righteousness of Christ. He could hardly believe that those English Protestants who had been shut out of the national church should, he said, have come to an indifferency as to the doctrine of justification and quarrel and dispute about the interest of works in justification, about general redemption, and about the perseverance of the saints. His problem? Richard Baxter was selling too many books. Growing old, facing bereavements among family and friends, and increasingly plagued by ill health, Owen had begun to doubt his legacy. Too much of his preaching, he feared, had been poor, weak, and perhaps quickly forgotten. I have now been very long, though very unprofitable, in the ministration of the word, he explained to his congregation in the spring of 1681. I'm ready to faint and give over and to beg of this church that they would think of some other person to conduct them in my room without these disadvantages. And Owen finally realized that the providential analysis that had been necessary to so much of his earlier work provided no effective theodicy to explain the situation of dissenters. I do not know, he said, that God has given me a greater rebuke in the whole course of my ministry than that I have been laboring in the fire to discover the causes of God's withdrawing from us without any success. Writing to a friend shortly before his death, Owen reported that he was laboring with age, infirmities, temptations, and troubles, and admitted dreadful apprehensions of the present state of things in the world. God, Owen believed, was withdrawing his presence from his churches and other professors of the gospel, and the decline was to continue. Shortly before his death, some of Owen's work was publicly burned in the university over which he had once been the vice-chancellor. Owen ended his ministry, he felt, in defeat. But he couldn't anticipate his afterlife. For in the 18th and 19th centuries, as nonconformists realigned with godly conformists to develop the new evangelical movement, new and diverse reading communities began to consume Owen's work and to establish his evangelical reputation. Owen's reputation was established in the dissenting and evangelical cultures of print. In his early lifetime, Owen had been an important voice in the development of Cromwellian institutions and in the emergence and sustention of Restoration nonconformity, but he doesn't appear to have been an especially popular writer, certainly nothing like the popularity of Richard Baxter that we've just heard about. Owen became an author when access to print was democratized in the early 1640s. His earliest work demonstrated his occasionally unreliable grasp of Reformed theology, even as it established his concern to defend truth as he understood it. His first few books were published in London by Philemon Stevens, an entrepreneur long associated with the radical religious underground of the 1630s, but they didn't sell well. Owen resorted to self-publication of the sermons he preached after the siege of Colchester, sermons entitled Ebenezer, published in 1648, a decision that might suggest that Stevens was no longer prepared to take financial risk on a relatively unknown writer in the increasingly crowded world of print. Owen enjoyed his first literary success in the sermon he preached the day after the execution of Charles I, which was published by one of Philemon Stevens' rivals, Matthew Symonds, in 2 editions in 1649. The success of this pamphlet encouraged Stevens to package the unsold text blocks of Owen's earlier books into a single volume, an anthology, which he marketed as certain treatises written by John Owen, formerly published at several times, now reduced into 1 volume, 1649. As Owen ascended into public view in the early 1650s, his work found a more ready audience, with his political and devotional writing making significantly greater impact than those more demanding publications addressing the theological problems of the period. Some titles proved to be an immediate success. The Advantage of the Kingdom of Christ and the Shaking of the Kingdoms of the World was published in London and Oxford in 1651 and Leith, near Edinburgh, in 1652. Its wide circulation perhaps explained by its utility in explaining the success of the Cromwellian invasion of Scotland. Of the Mortification of Sin and Believers was published in 1656, reprinted in 1658 and in 1668. Of Communion with God went through 2 quarto editions in 1657 and was republished in a second octavo edition in 1700, the smaller and cheaper format, perhaps indicating new expectations of how and by whom this book might be read. A Peace Offering in an apology and humble plea for indulgence went through 2 editions in 1667. A Discourse in Evangelical Love was published in 1672, reprinted in 1673, and again in 96. A Brief Vindication of the Nonconformists appeared in 3 editions in 1680. Owen's exposition of Hebrews 6 to 10 was published in 1680 and reprinted in 1681 and 84. Some considerations about union among Protestants passed through 2 editions in 1680, and his exposition of Hebrews 11 to 13 did the same in 1684. Though we cannot access the size of the print runs involved and need to make assumptions about sales based on the frequency of reprints, we can guess that Owen's devotional and political writings were most likely to find a ready audience within his own lifetime. Other of Owen's books took longer to establish their appeal. A Brief Instruction in the Worship of God was published in 1667, republished in 76 and 88. The exposition of Hebrews 1 and 2 was published in 1668 and went into a second edition only in 1676. A practical exposition of the 130th Psalm was published in 1669 and went into its second edition only 11 years later. An inquiry into the original nature, institution, power, order, and communion of evangelical churches was published in 1681 and went into a second edition only in 1696. A Brief and Impartial Account of the Nature of the Protestant Religion appeared in 82 and went into a second edition in 1690. The Principles of the Doctrine of Christ, Owen's 2 catechisms, was first published in 1645 and appeared in its second edition almost 40 years later, and again in 1700. Theologumena Pantidapa, his biblical theology, was published in Oxford in 61 and reprinted almost a generation later and for entirely new audiences in Bremen in 1684 and Franeker in 1700. This extraordinary and compendious history of culture and religion does not appear to have attracted high prices in the second-hand market, even shortly after its first publication. In 1665, for example, only 4 years after publication, the book was included in a shipment of 116 standard medical, legal, literary, and theological texts purchased by Chetham's Library in Manchester. But Owen's book was listed as one of the cheapest items in the shipment, costing 6 shillings and sixpence against the average item cost of approximately £1, 8 shillings. In other words, Owen's biggest book to date was worth 1/3 of the average value of the other books included in this shipment to Chetham's Library. In the challenging circumstances of the Restoration, therefore, Owen's most obvious audience was facing persecution and being monitored by government spies. Lady Warriston was only one of many Owen readers to find that their reading practice was being monitored by the government. Owen's work had again become a risk for publishers. But Owen's ability to attract a posthumous readership might be indicated by the fact that some of these books were republished long after his death in 1683. These republished items were indicating the kind of readers who continued to find Owen's work interesting, and the various uses to which his ideas and his reputation were being put. But these posthumous publications are indicative of the trends by which certain aspects of his distinctive political and theological work were forgotten, as Owen was repackaged for new audiences and began the slow and difficult path of becoming an evangelical. Owen's later reputation as a devotional writer of choice for right-thinking evangelicals was fashioned by the texts that were republished in the decades immediately following his death. Setting aside the first editions of books published after 1683, around about a dozen of Owen's works were republished in the period between his death and the end of the century. The contents of this list is surprising and illustrates the uneven processes by which Owen's reputation was being re-engineered and his publishers responded to their changing tastes of their audiences. Although we cannot assume that early modern readers read books as we do today, it's clear that publishers throughout the later Stuart period remained willing to take small financial risks on his principal devotional works. By contrast, Owen's polemical or more heavy theological works against Roman Catholics, Socinians, and Quakers did not continue to attract a continuing audience, if the frequency of reprints are any guide to reading habits. And later audiences consumed very little of his devotional writing from the 1650s. The heavy academic theology into which Owen had put so much effort in the 1650s, for example, the diatribe in divine justice, appeared to be forgotten. Perhaps surprisingly, Owen's early catechisms, the Principles of the Doctrines of Christ, in 1645, appeared in a second edition in 1684, 1 year after his death, despite the fact that the catechisms had become in important ways unrepresentative of his mature thought, especially in claiming that adoption, in some sense, was affected by the baptism of infants. Of Communion with God, which appeared in 2 quarto editions in 1657, was republished in octavo in its second edition in 1700. Owen's massive Prolegomena, Theologumena Pantidapa, 1661, was unique in being reprinted for audiences among the European Reformed. While it was certainly not the last of his books to be marketed, especially for overseas readers, it was quickly forgotten by English readers, being so technically and linguistically demanding. Of course, the many publishers involved in these enterprises were not making coordinated decisions about which Owen texts to republish, but they were at least gesturing towards their expectations about the changing reading and consumption habits of their target audiences as nonconformists became evangelicals. For even as English nonconformity continued to evolve, Owen's audience was changing. His congregation, after his death, was led by David Clarkson and Isaac Chauncey. Isaac Watts was appointed as Chauncey's assistant in 1699, and after the senior man's resignation in 1701, became the minister. But over the next 40 years, and from as early as the publication of the Christian Doctrine of the Trinity in 1722, Isaac Watts seemed to move away from the theological positions which Owen had articulated, eventually proposing doctrine which encouraged English Unitarians to believe that he had endorsed their Christology. Owen's work found a new audience in members of a very different religious community. The Methodist movement advertised its marked hostility to high Calvinism, even as John Wesley, one of its guiding lights, sought to reinforce its enthusiasm for subjective piety by including some of Owen's devotional writing in his Christian library in 1750. And so as London Congregationalists reconsidered Owen's truth claims, their fellow travellers in other locations remained appreciative of his contribution. Owen's work had a marked influence in American Puritan writing. In New England, Increase Mather read Owen's work in the Sabbath. Samuel Mather owned several volumes of his commentary in Hebrews. Jonathan Edwards was one of Owen's most active early American readers. He read and annotated his copy of an inquiry into the origin, nature, institution, power, order, and communion of evangelical churches, published in 1681, and owned Owen's commentary in Hebrews, which he cited on some 13 occasions, lending several of its volumes to a colleague. Edwards also cited Owen's Pneumatologia, 1674, on 6 occasions, twice in his Religious Affections. And he referred to Owen's exposition of Psalm 130 in his Miscellanies. American publishers recognized the significance of the market in the New World. Eshcol had reached its 8th American edition by 1771, and The Death of Death and the Death of Christ appeared in its first American edition in 1792. Scottish readers also continued to appreciate Owen's theology, and his works became a staple of their religious publishing industry. A second edition of A Humble Testimony to the Goodness and Severity of God, based on an Owen sermon in Luke chapter 13, appeared in Glasgow in 1737, with a third edition following within 20 years. A third edition of The Grace and Duty of Being Spiritually Minded was published in Glasgow by 1756 and was followed by a discourse of the work of the Holy Spirit in prayer. In the same year, another Glasgow publisher published Christologia, which he followed with the doctrine of justification by faith in 1760. That was the first time that Owen's book on justification had been republished in any country, almost 100 years after its first appearance in 1677. There was another flurry of publishers' interest in Owen in 1772, when Meditations and Discourses in the Glory of Christ and Christologia appeared in Edinburgh, and Of Temptation and The Nature, Power, Deceit, and Prevalency of the Remainders of Indwelling Sin in Believers appeared in Paisley. This latter edition may have been that read in January 1779 by the wife of an Anglican rector. She said, "I hope to read it often, that I may transcribe it on my memory and note the many useful remarks contained in it." Hands up anyone else here who's memorized portions of John Owen. Meanwhile, a new volume of collected sermons, 25 Discourses Suitable to the Lord's Supper, was published in Glasgow in 1774 and appeared in a second edition 1 year later with a portrait of the preacher. Two Short Catechisms, Owen's 1645 publication, had reached its 12th Glasgow publication by 1783. The market for Owen in Scotland was now strong enough to support the production of much more demanding work, such as his Christology, Glasgow 1790, of Communion with God, Glasgow 1792. Pneumatologia was published in Glasgow in 1791, and in a second Glasgow edition of 2 volumes 1 year later. In 1798, it appeared in the small town of Falkirk in an edition of 3 volumes. An edition of A Brief Declaration and Vindication of the Doctrine of the Trinity appeared in Glasgow in 1798. These technical, demanding publications bore witness to a remarkable Scottish resurgence of interest in Owen, and its influence may have been felt elsewhere. Owen's work in ecclesiology also began to circulate in Scotland. In the late 18th and early 19th century, these publications, defending, you remember, Congregationalism, came to the aid of those Scottish Presbyterians who were working to resist the influence of patronage within the established church, the right of local landholders to present clergy to congregations of the Church of Scotland, irrespective of the wish of members of the congregation. And so, a view of the nature, order, and communion of the churches of Christ was extracted from Owen's treatise of the evangelical churches and was published to include an appendix on Scripture Presbytery in Edinburgh in 1797. The same kinds of contexts and arguments supported the publication of The True Nature of a Gospel Church and Its Government in Glasgow in 1801. In the 1820s, Scottish readers continued to be interested by Owen's work in practical divinity. An Edinburgh edition of The Grace and Duty of Being Spiritually Minded appeared in 1820. William Collins in Glasgow published The Nature, Power, Deceit, and Prevalency of Indwelling Sin in 1825, with a second edition in 1827, appearing with a preface by Thomas Chalmers. As Chalmers' identification with the Owen corpus suggests, Owen was being co-opted in the evangelical struggle against patronage within the Church of Scotland, with an addition of 2 questions concerning the power of the Supreme Magistrate about religion and the worship of God, appearing in Glasgow in 1833, and extracts from Owen appearing as the right of the Church in particular congregations to appoint and elect their own pastors and elders, clearly manifested in Scripture, in Edinburgh in 1841, 2 years before the disruption of the Church of Scotland. Owen was not just becoming an evangelical. His literary legacy was being interpreted within particular theological controversies. But other Scottish Presbyterian theologians found Owen a useful tool. James Buchanan was one of a number of divines who continued to engage in a serious way with Owen's thinking in his dispute about the atonement with Thomas Erskine of Linlathen. Their debate was followed by a chapter-length discussion of Owen's reading of the atonement by John MacLeod Campbell in his book on the atonement, published in 1867. MacLeod Campbell took Owen as being typical of his age before entirely dismissing his conclusions. Owen, a convert from Presbyterian to independent church government, was now being co-opted by Scottish Presbyterians and identified as someone whose work other more progressive Presbyterians might need to resist. Elsewhere in the British Isles, publishers adopted a more eclectic response to Owen. In Ireland, Owen found new readers in the aftermath of the French Revolution. The Shaking and Translating of Heaven and Earth was reprinted in Belfast and Monaghan in 1795 and again in Belfast in 1797, 1 year before the Great Rebellion in Ireland of 1798. Through Ireland, Scotland, and the New World, Owen's reputation was growing beyond his native land. But Owen never entirely lost his English audience. The slow move towards republication of his work in English centres of print might suggest that Owen's work continued to be consulted by means of second-hand copies. English readers put their older copies of Owen to heavy use. Some of the most interesting evidence of engagement and transmission of ownership between English readers can be found in texts now held in the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. Its copy of the Exercitations in the Epistle to the Hebrews, 1674, bears marks of multiple ownership. Sam Sewell, who may have purchased or first read the volume in June 1688, appears to have transferred ownership to Addington Davenport before Samuel Eaton recorded his purchase of the book in Boston in June 1766. His ownership may have been followed by that of S.K. Smith, whose name is recorded in pencil on the rear of the front board, and whose ownership devolved onto Dr. Abbott Smith, who donated the book finally to the library. One owner of this text appointed to work out on its title page how many years had passed between publication and his or her reading of the text, the answer being 166 years. Of course, much of this inscription is ambiguous as evidence of how the text was being used. Less ambiguous, though from Owen's perspective rather more unfortunate, was the reading experience of William Abbott, who in 1697 inscribed his copy of the Causes, Ways, and Means of Understanding the Mind of God with a list of his hats and cravats. Similarly, the Folger's copy of Owen's first volume of the Commentary on Hebrews is annotated in several hands, apparently over several centuries, with the most recent annotator spending considerable energy comparing the author's chronological computations with those of Joseph Mead, using the margins to jot down lengthy numerical tables and checks on Owen's Latin, while also preparing an additional contents page of matters of prime concern. If English publishers were slower to reprint Owen's works, therefore, it might be because so many of the older editions were continuing to circulate and to change hands. But some English publishers were providing new material. A biographical note by Edward Williams introduced an abridged version of an exposition of the Epistle to the Hebrews in London in 1790. Its appearance was perhaps more explicable than the republication of the Shaking and Translating of Heaven and Earth in London in 1793, though perhaps this bore some resemblance in terms of cause and effect to the republication by Irish publishers of the same sermon in the aftermath of the French Revolution. At the end of the 18th century, therefore, Owen had become a feature of the English provincial press, especially in such traditional centres of nonconformity as East Anglia and the Midlands. An edition of the Meditations and Discourses on the Glory of Christ was published in Sheffield in 1792, with editions of Pneumatology and the Reason of Faith appearing in Coventry in the same year and in 1799. One generation later, London publishers produced an edition of William Orme's biography in 1820, as well as texts of a practical exposition of Psalm 130 in 1824 and a treatise on the Sabbath in 1829. In the same period, a movement away from hyper-Calvinism among English particular Baptists was dubbed by one of its proponents as Owenism, a signal of the extent to which Owen's reputation still functioned as a barometer of orthodoxy within some sections of English dissent, and as a metonym for a far more moderate and evangelistic Calvinism. By the end of the 18th century, therefore, English publishers were recovering confidence in the marketability of Owen's theological work. By the mid-19th century, Owen was being represented as an exemplar for Victorian evangelicalism, even being identified with some of its peculiarities. Charles Bridge, a Church of England minister in Cambridge, included a substantial discussion of Owen in his textbook on the Christian ministry, published in 1830. Bridges noted that some parts of Owen's thinking about the Spirit were discordant in some particulars from the principles of our church. He regretted Owen's unhappy political bias. But Bridges added, "Who would refuse to dig into the golden mine from disgust at base alloy that will ever be found to mingle itself with the ore?" Other adulation for Owen was more succinct. For C.H. Spurgeon, the pulpit hero of Victorian London, Owen was simply the Prince of Divines. Spurgeon's accolade came as Owen's stock rose, with a general resurgence of interest in Puritan piety and theology, which drove the publication of a large number of collected works projects in the middle and later 19th century. The publication of the Gould edition, still in print with the Banner of Truth, was part of a trend that also saw the production of the collected works of Richard Baxter, Thomas Brooks, John Goodwin, Thomas Manton, and Richard Sibbes, among others. The extraordinary enthusiasm of Victorian evangelicals for Puritan literature nuances David Bebbington's argument that there existed a sharp discontinuity between Puritans and their evangelical successors. Rather, as this evidence suggests, evangelicals invented the category of Puritan in their search for a usable past. In fact, the veneration for Owen and other Puritan worthies was so pronounced as to drive, on some occasions, extraordinary historical revision. You'll see in the slide John Rogers Herbert's famous painting, The Assertion of Liberty of Conscience by the Independents of the Westminster Assembly of Divines, first exhibited in 1844. This image is the best-known representation of the proceedings of the Assembly, but it's notable for its total fabrication of historical evidence. Herbert, who was a convert to Roman Catholicism, was encouraged to work in the painting by a congregational minister, James W. Massey, who provided an initial sketch of this group portrait. But Herbert's final result included representations of some of the most important independents of the period, including Owen, whose back is there on facing you to the right of the slide, sitting beside Oliver Cromwell with his famous russet coat, and John Milton, whose face directly addresses you on the extreme right of that slide. None of these men attended the assembly. But Owen's inclusion was more than just anachronistic. His reputation would suffer with the eclipse of interest in Puritanism in the later Victorian period, but in mid-century, Owen was being identified as the single most significant theologian of the period. He was the Puritan whose work defined the Victorian evangelical faith. He was the evangelical by whose work an authentic Puritanism could be measured and identified. For many evangelicals, it was no longer possible to think of Puritan orthodoxy apart from the presence of John Owen. Owen's canonization as a Victorian evangelical exemplar was both a cause and consequence of the edition of his works edited and published by William Gould, 1850 to 55. The ready availability of the Gould edition perhaps disguises the extent to which, for most of the period since his death, English readers had not been able to benefit from a standard text of Owen's works. In this respect, Owen's literary remains were unlike those of other Puritan leaders, whose theological legatees rapidly produced complete editions of their works. Thomas Manton died in 1677. His works appeared in 1681. Thomas Goodwin died in 1679. His works appeared in 1681. Stephen Charnock died in 1680. His works appeared in 1684. John Flavel died in 1691. His works appeared in 1701. William Bates died in 1699. His complete works appeared in 1700. Most of these Puritans had their works published within 2 or 3 years of their death. But the first attempt to produce a complete set of Owen's works was made almost 40 years after his death, in 1721. The editors of this project were all eminent independents in London. John Astley, who wrote a biography for the edition, John Nesbitt, Matthew Clark, Thomas Ridgely, Thomas Bradbury. The consortium established a firm financial footing for their project, gathering 375 subscribers to put up money up front to support the work in the edition. And a sign that Owen was beginning to emerge from the representational difficulties associated with his role in the mid-17th century political crisis. But despite the 375 subscribers, the editorial team was only able to produce one of their projected volumes, collecting Owen's sermons, tracts, and Oxford orations. By contrast, when Gould began work in his edition in the 1840s, he was able to gather 3,000 subscribers, a number almost unprecedented in the history of religious publications. For Owen's influence continued as evangelicalism continued to diversify through the late 19th and early 20th centuries. William Kelly, leader among the English exclusive brethren, praised the excellent and learned Dr. Owen and referred to Owen's work to defend his own claim that Christians should not use the Lord's Prayer. Abram Cowper, the Dutch theologian, newspaper editor, and prime minister, admitted to being heavily indebted to Owen in his theology of the Holy Spirit. Martin Lloyd-Jones, who had become one of the most distinguished nonconformist preachers of the mid-20th century, was much inspired by the second-hand set of Owen's works he was given as a wedding present in 1927. In 1949, Jim Elliot, during his student days at Wheaton College, reflected on Owen's arguments for effective redemption as part of his growing rejection of Arminian and dispensational theology as he prepared for the mission to Ecuador, which would end with him becoming one of the most famous evangelical missionary martyrs of the 20th century. Jim Elliot's discussion of Owen signals the extent to which members of the Brethren movement had preserved an interest in Puritan writings within discursive communities which were often isolated from the broader cultures of evangelicalism. Elliot's engagement with Owen is a useful reminder that the revival of Calvinistic theology among British and American evangelicals was taking place a full decade before the Banner of Truth published The Death of Death in 1958. J.I. Packer, who contributed a robust and energetic introduction to the new edition of The Death of Death, could hardly have anticipated how successful the Banner's republication of Owen would become. For Owen's appeal has continued as the 400th anniversary of his birth has approached. The revival of interest in Owen's work has encouraged evangelical publishers to make a number of his most important works available in updated English. Even as scholarly output in Owen has blossomed. Some entrepreneurs, recognizing Owen's status in the new Calvinism, have rushed to identify an Owen brand. A brief search of the internet will demonstrate the broad range of clothes and crockery that now bear Owen's image. 3 centuries after Owen began to be refashioned as an evangelical, evangelicals are increasingly fashioning themselves in his likeness, an irony that reveals as much about the commercial vitality of contemporary religion as it does about the making of Owen's evangelical reputation. So how does this reflection on Owen's literary afterlife help us think about the making of his evangelical reputation? I suppose, first of all, it helps us to remember that all reputations are made by processes of remembering and forgetting. It helps us see the material circumstances in which that remembering and forgetting can take place. There were reasons why publishers did not take risks on Owen's heavier theological writings. There's a reason why it took almost a century for his book on justification to go into a second printing. There are reasons why Irish publishers were drawn to his apocalyptic material in the midst of the ferment and chaos of rebellion and revolution. There are reasons why Scottish publishers were drawn to his ecclesiological works as they contended for the rights of congregations to elect their own elders. Secondly, this reflection helps us remember the variety of evangelicalism in the 18th and 19th centuries. Too often, the question of the relationship between Puritans and evangelicals assumes that there was no variety in either. In fact, the character of Isaac Watts' evangelicalism could be different in many ways from that of John Wesley, Thomas Chalmers, or William Kelly. But these leaders of English independence, Scottish Presbyterians, and Irish exclusive brethren could all find things to appreciate in Owen's work. Thirdly, this reflection helps us think about the Christian's experience of defeat. John Owen narrowly escaped death at the hands of a brutal, retaliatory restoration regime. But he did not see the Reformation and revival he worked for. He died believing his work had failed. On the 350th anniversary of Owen's birth, in 1956, another reader of Owen was martyred in his quest to take the gospel to the tribes of Ecuador. Neither Owen nor Jim Elliot achieved what they thought to be their goal. But who among us would say they were defeated? Thank you very much.
Well, again, we have some time for questions, and we'd like to take those questions and try to repeat the question before you give the answer.
Or we can go straight to coffee.
Maybe it's Monday morning. So.
Yes, thank you very much.
Any questions? If not, we'll break. Oh, okay.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could give more detail on your view of the rebranding of Owen by evangelicals. Is it fair? Is there twisting of facts? Could you elaborate a little bit?
The question is about the evangelical rebranding of Owen. Is it fair? Is there a twisting of facts, etc.? I'm not aware there's any twisting of facts. I think I've learned a great deal from all the work that's been published on Owen, much of which is excellent. I draw attention in particular to Michael Haken's recent book on John Owen and the Christian Life, Tim Cooper's excellent book on John Owen, Richard Baxter, and the Reformation of Nonconformity. There's a great deal of incredibly helpful material out there. I suppose what I was trying to do in today's discussion was to think about how Owen was repackaged over several centuries. Nathan Finn is going to talk us through the 20th century reception of Owen in more detail. But I was interested in thinking about why some things of Owen are published quickly and rapidly in multiple editions, and so many of the heavier theological works are not. And I think the fact that it takes a century for his book on justification to be reprinted is indicative that there's no market for this kind of sustained theological thinking, or that sustained theological thinking doesn't need to use Owen with his insights into justification as a crucial point of reference. In more contemporary terms, the fact that Owen is now something which we can use to decorate our clothing becomes deeply ironic given his concerns about how Christians should appropriately dress. And there may be something that we need to think about there.
So you think that there's some things that are incongruent with Owen in modern evangelicalism? Is that fair to say?
So the question is about whether there are incongruities between Owen and modern evangelicalism. Fundamentally, yes, fundamentally. It's very difficult to generalize about modern evangelicalism. Where is its point of reference? It's like grasping with a jellyfish, isn't it? It's grasping sand. It's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It believes everything and nothing simultaneously. And I think one of the great things about conferences like this is that we can find anchor points in the past. And we don't need to accept everything uncritically, far from it. But it helps us find moments or individuals, such as we heard this morning with Richard Baxter, that we can learn from and I think begin to appreciate the value of church history. Yes?
So in your biography, you highlight the scarcity of personal information about Owen, just how close, like he doesn't give a whole lot of his personal thoughts. This may be a long shot, but can you comment on how that scarcity might either help or hinder, just maybe affect this reception? Did it hinder his early reception? Does it aid him to be kind of co-opted and adapted to different circumstances?
That's a really interesting question. The question is about whether the lack or abundance of biographical information on Owen affected the way that he was received or read. Very interesting question, because I think today, as readers within evangelicalism broadly construed, we inhabit a very personality-driven culture where we want to know about the people who write books, and somehow the biographical content of that person's life in some way validates or inspires the experience of reading their work. Early modern readers read in a completely different way. They weren't interested in individuals bearing their souls on paper. This is a modern aberration, really, and it's not something you see a great deal of. There are massive cultural differences between 17th century England and 21st century America, and that I think is one of them. Writing about Owen is liberating because there are so few facts to consider. And, frankly, if you want to write a biography, find someone who said nothing about themselves.
Well, I know some people are claiming that Owen is Welsh, and how is Owen's reception in Welsh? And have any of his works been published in Welsh, translated into Welsh, before Lloyd George?
That's a great question. The question is about Owen's Welsh identity and about whether any of Owen's material was translated into Welsh. There is a good reason why I did not include any Welsh titles in today's presentation, and it's simply because there are no consonants. I have no idea, perhaps Michael could help us on how to pronounce Welsh words. Yes, Owen did come from a Welsh family. He himself was born in Oxfordshire, as was his father before him. You need to go back several generations before there's any Welsh connection in the lineal descent. Owen did have a Welsh uncle who sponsored his education, and he and the uncle fell out whenever the Civil War came, and they adopted support for different sides in that war. Owen did find Welsh readers. Welsh nonconformity has a very distinctive tradition, starting from the 1650s when Baptists and Independents began very enterprising missionary campaigns through the Principality. And so Welsh descent through the 19th, 18th, and 19th centuries is strongly driven by the ecclesiological values that would be familiar in a conference like this. And of course, then they did look to Owen to validate that or to guide them in that. I simply don't have the language experience to be able to begin to unpack what that might mean. But thank you for the question. Yep.
I was wondering what was unique about the piety and theology of the Victorian era that caused Owen to have become like the revival notoriety whenever the piety and theology of his own day was similar to that of the Victorian era, yet he didn't experience that. So get your finger on the main
Could you just repeat the first part of that question again?
The piety and theology, you were talking about the Victorian
Yeah.
evangelicalism caused this resurgence of Owen's works. What was unique about that period, situationally or culturally, that caused that revival whenever in his own day he didn't have such notoriety?
That's a really, really interesting question. The question is asking, what was it about evangelical piety in the mid-Victorian period that gave Owen a prominence or republished his works and the works of other Puritans, I guess, in a way that wasn't the case back in the 17th century? I wonder if I could draw Dr. Haken into this conversation. I'm thinking about Thomas Carlyle. I'm thinking about the massive interest in the mid-Victorian period for writing popular histories of the English Civil War. There's the rise of Whig thinking about the past, in which individuals are looking for resonances of their legal or political rights within an earlier period. And I suppose one way of doing that is to think, and Thomas Carlyle, I think, is typical of this, is to think of Cromwell and the independence and the Puritan Revolution as somehow enunciating principles of freedom, democracy, liberty, parliamentary rule, the English Constitution, and so on. And I suppose that there is, as Victorian evangelicals search for a usable past, they then get drawn back to individuals like Cromwell, who's Thomas Carlyle's great edition of his works gets published. It's hugely successful. Owen and other Puritans. Milton, of course, gets a huge amount of Victorian exposure, to such an extent that when his De Doctrina Christiana is published in 1824, advocating a Socinian view of the Trinity, no one believes it's by him. So I suppose I would start there, but Michael, can I draw you into this?
Yeah, in 1851, they did a census of, in terms of denominational presence, how many people on a given Sunday, it was arranged beforehand, that every church in Britain would report how many people were present in that church on a given Sunday. And the nonconformists, Baptists and Congregationalists in England, and now the Methodists, discovered that they had a greater percentage than the Anglicans. And it was an enormous kind of victory. They realized that after 200 years of really being second-class citizens, they had now a significant hold on the British public. And that inaugurates really what comes to be known as the nonconformist century, which really lasts until the First World War. They have significant political power. And I think in this, it's the going back and rediscovering that they've got a variety of figures back there that they can claim. Oliver Cromwell, up until the 19th century, was absolutely reviled by there'll be a few who would have loved him, but it's in the 19th century. Thomas Carlyle comes out with this series of volumes on his works, and it's a bestseller. And you've got all these Puritan works being reprinted. It's I think, very much tied into the political realities that the nonconformists now realize that they had a significant influence politically to reshape Britain that they hadn't had for 200 years. They hadn't had it since the 1640s, 1650s. So I think some of that is certainly what's going on here as well.
Thanks. And just as a footnote to that, it's telling that W.H. Gould, who edited Owen, was in fact a Reformed Presbyterian minister. So this is all about the creation of a nonconformist community, isn't it? And the republication of Puritan works builds this political social platform. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you.